We move over to some time in the scriptures today. We're in Romans chapter 1, and we've been in Romans chapter 1 for the past 2 weeks. And this, I promise you, will be the last sermon within the unconformed study in Romans chapter 1. But we really wanted to lean into this chapter because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the letter and the rest of the study. And if I can kind of just quickly orient you where we're at in the study, we've been talking about not conforming to the patterns of this world, like not being shaped the same way that everybody else is shaped, not doing the things that everybody else does and getting the results that everybody else gets. And we've really been focusing in on Fairfield County and the pace of life around here. And so maybe you even feel that already this morning, like there's just a different pace that our soul operates at. And I heard it said this way one time, that God moves at 3.5 miles per hour. That's the speed of human walking. And if you think about it, it's like a good kind of orientation question for your own soul is, what pace have you been going at as of late? Is it a good and beautiful pace? Is your life full of God's goodness and God's beauty? And eventually, you can't really avoid it in Romans chapter 1, eventually this gets to a matter of ethics. It gets to the actual practices, the habits of our lives, the way in which we're living, the patterns that actually shape our life. And Paul, this may seem like, in a minute, I'm going to read something that's pretty ugly. But when I get to that, I want you to have your heart prepared for it, because this isn't like a checklist of like the ethics police. Okay, Jesus didn't call Christians to be the ethics patrol and to go out and look for all the things that are wrong in the world and to issue citations. You know, it's not Christians' responsibility to go out there with a list like the one that I'm about to read. It's not our responsibility to go out there with this checklist and to issue citations to all the people who live according to a different pattern than us. Paul is painting a picture in Romans chapter 1 of all the things that have gone wrong with humanity. And unfortunately, he has a lot to pull from. In Romans chapter 1, verses 28 to 32, it says that people did not see fit to acknowledge God. And so God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness. Remember, righteousness is the word we've been talking about, good and beautiful. They've been filled with all the opposite of that. They've been filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful. Fairfield County. Just saying, that's a Midwesterner. Inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. Whew. Can you believe it? This is just like a strange list to read here. Foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's good and beautiful decree, though they know God's righteous decree, that people who practice these things deserve to die, that's the natural consequence of their behavior. It brings death, not life, into the world. They not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them. One author calls this a catalog of evils. And already, right, you're probably looking at the list and you're like, oh man, which one's he going to get me on? Because that's what Christians do, right? Ethics police. We're patrollers going out there looking for which thing you're doing wrong. And we're going to issue a citation and write you up for it. But that's not what Paul is doing with this list. Paul is taking this smattering and seemingly random, there's really no rhyme or reason to this list, seemingly random catalog of evils, and he's making the point that he's been making within Romans chapter 1. The patterns of the world are not working. They are not working. And yet we continue to live into them. We continue to be shaped the way that everybody else is shaping, because, and here's the recap of the last 2 weeks, Romans chapter 1, verses 19 to 21, and again into verse 25, he says that we've made foolish exchanges. Can I turn that off? Not clicking. So can we click over to that, Scott? Next one. In chapter 19 into verse 21, it says that we can know things about God. God has made it plain to us, because he's shown it to us, his invisible attributes, mainly his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So people are without excuse. Although they know God, they do not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they become futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts are darkened. Verse 25, we talked about this last week. Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worship and serve creatures rather than the Creator. We've been given over to deception, which leads to dysfunction. And the dysfunction just gets normalized and celebrated, and nobody talks about it. And the outcome of that is all those damaging behaviors, all of those things that bring about destruction. Paul is making it very clear. Let's see if this is back on nice. We have good and beautiful instincts. The human soul hungers and has an appetite for goodness and beauty. Our good and beautiful instincts perceive God, but we prefer alternatives. We keep making foolish exchanges. We keep following the patterns of the world. We cannot cultivate beauty because we're so cluttered with busy. The question throughout this whole series, right, is am I cultivating beauty or am I just caught up in busy? Is my life full of goodness and beauty? Or is my life just full? Just a lot going on. Just always doing something, always hustling, always striving, always trying to prove that my life is worth something. We perceive God, but we prefer the alternatives. We've got to clear some dysfunctional patterns if we're going to cultivate some beauty. When we first moved into our house, there was a whole lot of overgrowth in all directions. And it's taken years, and it continues to take time to clear out what had grown in there over the course of years, and to now start cultivating, making something beautiful within our yard. And I'll let you know that task, that falls entirely to Leslie. I do none of that. Why don't I want to go out and do yard work? It's hard. I don't like that. I might get poison ivy. And I think we all are in a similar place. We see the way the patterns of the world are operating, but it's tough work to clear out those patterns of dysfunction and to cultivate new habits, new patterns. A more functional, a more good and beautiful life is difficult. But if I could just kind of bring some of what Paul is talking about and some of these pieces of Romans 1 together and identify maybe what is the first pattern that we give ourselves over to. It's a primal pattern. When we worship and serve creatures, we behave like animals. In some ways, humans and the animals have a lot of things in common. And we'll even refer to some people in an animalistic way. We'll be like, oh man, there's a bear in the office. You know, oh man, there's a lion on the field. Oh, that person's a snake. We'll use animalistic ways of talking about people sometimes, but we recognize that there's something primal about us. There's something animalistic about us. There's something creaturely about us. In fact, in the lower parts of our brain, sometimes that'll be referred to as like the reptilian brain. Like there's these very basal, instinctual parts of us that can be very, very animalistic. And sometimes the patterns of this world are such that we're just encouraged to let our bodies dominate our brains. Just do what feels good. Do what feels right. Do whatever you can. And when you look around at the global situation that we're in, when you see all of these different things play out, like Romans chapter 1, 23, 24 says, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts. Just go after whatever feels good. Or he says that they were given over to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. For this reason, God gave them up. He handed them over to their dishonorable passions. He says, if you want to worship and serve creatures, then you can become like an animal. And I think we have to kind of look just on the furthest range of this, right? When I say like this is a global situation, like people in the world regularly and ritualistically harm children. People in the world regularly objectify other people. People in the world actively commit violent acts against other humans. Sometimes people act like animals. And N.T. Wright, he said it this way. He says, the line that Paul is drawing here isn't the line between us and them. It's not between the ethics patrol and everybody else. It's not between Christians and all the heathens. The line that Paul is trying to draw runs right down the middle of you and me. Right through the low brain, high brain. Do we act like animals? Surely not me. No. There are much worse people than me. Right? Isn't that kind of how we tell us? Let me just say, have you ever been hangry? Yeah. You know what I'm talking about? This is an example, right, of body over brain. When I am hungry, I am given over to some things, some dishonorable passions, Paul might say. Sometimes my body overcomes my spirit, and I behave in a violent way with my words because I'm hungry or tired. That's just a low-hanging example. Sometimes we purposely give our bodies authority over our brains. It's what we do with substances, right? Chemical substances. I was just even thinking lately about the nature of my relationship to alcohol. And how what alcohol does is it inhibits the higher part of our brain. And it enhances the lower part. It allows us to live into our animal instincts. When I think about that, I'm like, man, you guys have heard me say this before. Why people ask, why are you starting a church in Fairfield County? I'm like, well, because there's more liquor stores here than there are churches. How are we dealing with how frustrating life can be? Sometimes we yield to something to feel a certain way. This all is labeled as hedonism. And that's what Paul is talking about. Hey, we're prone to be hedonists, to just do what feels good. That's kind of pattern 1, strategy 1. Romans chapter 1, verse 29 says that they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, and the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all righteousness of men who by their unrighteousness have suppressed the truth. When we keep living into a pattern of animalistic behavior, it buries the good and beautiful stuff that we're designed for. It suppresses it. It pushes it away. The strategy of the enemy, first and foremost, is to dehumanize us into savages. To make us less than the image bearers that we are. We are God's image bearers, created for goodness and beauty, designed and destined to cultivate goodness and beauty in the world. But we give ourselves over to these animal instincts and we become less than human. Less than human. We dehumanize ourselves and live as savages, living according to how you feel, doing what you want as long as you can get away with it, is a living hell. The world that Paul describes here is a world apart from God. It sounds a lot like, and we've talked about how Romans chapter 1 is kind of paralleling the origin story in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's one of the worst lines in the Bible. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Now at this moment, you're thinking, I thought this series was called Good and Beautiful. But sometimes we just have to call a spade a spade. When you look at the world that we live in, is the world we live in working? If you were to remove every hint of the Christian faith and the Jewish faith, the story of God, if you were to remove all of that out of the human story, what would be left? What would be left of humanity if you took the goodness and beauty of God out of the equation? The scriptures say that is hell. That's the description of hell, a place without God. Now, we look at that and we're like, whew, I know that's not for me. That is not the path that I want to be on. But there's a second pattern that Paul addresses in Romans chapter 1 that slips. And we know that the path of hedonism is probably not going to lead to flourishing. Many of us have just tasted and experienced that path to know it well enough. But the second pattern isn't to dehumanize the savage, it's to deify the sophisticated. Now this one is the pattern of secularism. This is the pattern that says you can create heaven without God. And what happens after Genesis chapter 6, what happens after the flood narrative, is humanity sets out on this utopian endeavor to build a better and more perfect world. They start striving to build a world that will be beautiful, a world that will reach up into the very heavens. We see this in Genesis chapter 11, verses 3 and 4. The people say, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Now that may seem like a weird thing to acknowledge, but what it says is that humans started to discover the power of technologies. They started figuring out how to do things better. And so they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole earth. After the strategy of savagery has failed, the enemy moves over to the strategy of deification. People will become busy with creating utopia. And in so doing, they'll lose sight of heaven. They'll try to build a heaven without God. They'll busy themselves with striving for what God is already willing to give. And the story of the Tower of Babel, God looks upon this tower, and it says he comes down from the heavens. We're striving to build a utopia instead of seeking heaven. God is always moving toward us, but we busy ourselves climbing toward him. Trying to deify ourselves. We talked about it last week, becoming little Caesars. Trying to live for the glory that we think we can attain or that we can build. It's crazy to me that once we declutter our soul from the chaos of those animal instincts, we reclutter it with controlled chaos. We reclutter it with all this attempts to build something, to make something of ourselves. Why do we do that? Romans 1:28 says that, this is the New Living Translation, says that we think it's foolish to acknowledge God. So God abandons us to our foolish thinking, and he lets us do things that should never be done. Though we know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, yet we do them anyway, and worse yet, we encourage others to do them too. Why do we do this? Why do we keep living into these patterns? Because we're willing to settle for the world's applause when we know we don't have God's approval. I've said this, like, dysfunction has become so normalized and celebrated in the patterns of our world that to behave functionally feels weird, feels off. To be unconformed feels wrong because we're so used to the dysfunction. And people will applaud you for being busy. People will be like, oh, you are an important person. Look at all the stuff you got going on. Look at how meaningful you are to your family, to your society, to this place at large. You are such a great person because you are so busy. But inside, you'll know, you're like, you know what though? It's just stuff. I just am busy. But people will keep cheering for you, and we'll keep doing it. We'll just keep living in the dysfunction. Have you guys, have you seen or read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Willy Wonka? Okay, so there's a character in Willy Wonka, Mike TV. Mike TV. And this is the way that screens, I used to have my parents tell me all the time, they're like, hey, TV will rot your brain. And I was like, I envisioned, because this is the era I grew up in, I envisioned like This Is Your Brain, where they hold the egg and then they crack it in the skillet and it sizzles, and this is your brain on drugs. That's what I imagined my parents were talking about when they say that it'll rot your brain. I thought watching TV is going to like go inside and scramble my brain the way that drugs does. But what actually happens with a screen is much darker than that. When we talk about a debased mind, it's the idea that what we're ingesting is actually shaping the patterns inside our brain that tell us how to operate. And Mike TV from Willy Wonka believed he was a cowboy. And he would sit there and he'd bang, 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 he'd fire his gun at the TV. He looks at his mom, and his mom's like, this is where he eats all of his meals. We bring the TV dinner right to him so he never has to leave the screen. And then he looks over his shoulder, he's like, yeah, my dad won't let me have a real gun. And the dad's sitting over there, he's like, yeah, not till you're 12, son. It's like there's this affirmation from both of his parents of this destructive behavior. And here's the crazy thing. You just want to grab Mike TV by the shoulders. You want to look at him and be like, you're not a cowboy. You never leave the couch. You are the furthest thing from a cowboy. But we get so used to dysfunction, we start believing lies about ourselves. These patterns are very, very, very deceptive. And ultimately, they lead to destruction. I was just thinking this week about an example. I just kind of want to autopsy something with you on a couple of different levels. And this is just like, again, for people that read through Romans chapter 1 in a sitting and they're like, God, Paul's so cranky, and this is where the Christian ethic police and all these people come in, and they're just like always trying to catch you doing something wrong. It's like, no. Christians just have this framework for understanding the world where we recognize just how hard everything is, how chaotic it all could be. Maybe another example would be from a recent movie, or more recent movie that came out, Hacksaw Ridge, which sounds like a really bloody, crazy movie, but it's a war movie. It's about World War II. In the midst of this movie, you hear the story of Desmond Dross. And Desmond Dross, because of his convictions, would not carry a gun in the military. He felt obligated to serve his country, but he did not feel that he could carry a weapon because he believed in his heart of hearts that it was wrong to do violence to another human. So here's a person in military service whose convictions lead them to not even carrying a gun into battle. In the movie Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa, there's this 400-foot cliff. And what happens in the midst of the battle is the Allied forces, they order a retreat, but his comrades are up on top of the ridge, and so he actually ascends the rope of the ridge over the course of a 12-hour period, up and down a 400-foot cliff. He ascends a number of times. He actually ends up saving 75 of his comrades. The person who's not focused on shooting is the person most competent to save. As Christians, we got to get that into our mind. We do not go out into the world to shoot people. Gotcha, citation, ethics police again. We go into the world recognizing that the world is hurting from all of this stuff. There are so many wounds around us, and if we would just lay down our arms, we might use our hands and feet to actually save and restore people. Desmond Dross is a great example of what it looks like when you have an organizing framework that makes sense of all the broken stuff in the world. As Christians, we call it sin. And I think people would really love to have language for all the stuff that's going on. An organizing framework. Let's just take it a level further. World War II, we'll just kind of look at it again. If you're like, I just don't get why people are so upset about, all this stuff, and because the choices we make matter. We're talking about global catastrophe, a worldwide war. Humans are capable of that. We've proven it time and time again. In the Battle of Okinawa alone, there are nearly 50,000 casualties of American soldiers, 12,000 plus actually killed in battle. On the opposing side, for the Japanese, 110,000 are killed, not including civilian casualties. Hundreds of thousands of people murdered because we can't figure out how to build utopia. And we have competing visions of what that is. We're willing to go to war. Now, after the Battle of Okinawa, it appears that there's a path forward for the United States and the Allied forces into Japan, right? Except that Truman, the president at the time, knows that there are 2 million Japanese soldiers waiting on the island of Japan. And as the wearied and kind of battle-worn soldiers from Okinawa are moving on, Harry Truman has to make a decision. And for the first time in human history, just a few months after the Japanese had surrendered at Okinawa, the Americans drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. That's the destruction humanity is capable of. That's what competing visions of utopia do to the world. And then, Japan doesn't surrender. So Truman drops a second atomic bomb 3 days later. Now, I don't, this isn't a platform or a position. I just want to show you what Paul might say to us in our own day and age. He had a catalog of evils that he held up before the people of Rome and said, do you want to keep living like the Romans do? Or is there another path? Is there another way? Do we want to keep going about the world according to the world's pattern? Do we want to keep living in the world according to the world's patterns? I don't. I feel very fortunate in my life. I lived like a wild man, like up to age 20, okay? So like, when I was reading that Genesis 6 stuff, I was like, that might have been my life verse for a while. Like, I had given myself over to animal instincts and all the things, right? And I found that just didn't satisfy. In fact, it created a greater void. And I was at school at the time, I was in college, and I could see like the other path forward was the world's offering of building heaven without God. I could stay at Illinois Wesleyan, I could study hard, I could clean up, stop drinking booze, stop mistreating people, stop doing all that stuff. You could just kind of build up a good and nice looking life, Charlie, and at the end of the day, you'll find yourself just as empty. But in the midst of that season of life, God grabbed hold of my heart and he said, Charlie, there's another path forward. Follow me. Follow Christ. Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 set the tone for the entire letter. And I found this to be true of myself at age 20, that I was no longer ashamed of the good news of Christ. I saw it for what it truly was. It is a message of hope. It is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believes. This is the path forward. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes. It tells us how God makes us right in his sight, and it's accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the scriptures say, it's through faith that a righteous person has life. So the question as we kind of wrap this whole piece up is, are you full with living or busy while dying? Full with living or busy while dying? Someone encouraged me in the midst of all this talk of schedules and stuff. They said, you know what? I've started changing the way I respond when people ask, hey, how you doing? And we talked about this, right? How you doing? Busy. Oh, I'm not busy. And then everybody looks at the person who's not busy, like, what's wrong with you? But deep down, they're like, what's different? What is it? I think we would be wise to answer that question. If we focus on cultivating beauty rather than creating busy, we'd be wise to answer that question with, hey, how are you doing? I'm full. I'm full of good and beautiful things. Because Jesus has called me on a different path. He's invited me to come. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 to 30 says, are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to Jesus. Get away with him and you'll recover your life. He'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with him and work with him. Watch how he does it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. Jesus won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with him and learn to live freely and lightly. In the midst of all this stuff going on in the world, the invitation of Jesus remains. Do you want to recover your life? Do you want to learn a different pattern? Do you want to learn a pattern that's labeled as the unforced rhythms of grace? Do you want to learn to live freely and lightly? Come to Jesus. And stop following the crazy. We said it this way, and this will be the last time I encourage you with this because it's been 3 weeks now, and I feel like I'm on the borderline of becoming that guy. 3 things that would help you to reframe your patterns. On a daily basis, start the day with something spiritual, not with your screen. Just set that pattern up. First things first, I want God before anything else every single day. I don't want to be my TV formed by my screen. I want to walk with Jesus. I want to learn the unforced rhythms of grace on a weekly basis. Let's start our day on Sunday with worship. Let's not start our day on Monday with work. If you start your week with work, you'll be tempted to believe that you are what you produce. And we talked about that last week. You're not. This fall, last chance, because we're like into it now, right? Last chance on the fall. Instead of asking, what do I already have scheduled this fall? Make sure that your schedule fits what your soul needs this fall. What does your soul need this fall? Prioritize your soul over your schedule. Otherwise, you'll find yourself at the mercy of everybody else. So if you would stand with us today. We're going to sing another song as we prepare our hearts to gather around the table. But I want you to take to heart that invitation. Come to Jesus today. Learn a new rhythm. And let's see where he leads us.